There are other DRB Arctic projects that deserve much more attention that I'm starting to look into. An extensive, quote, clinical and biochemical study of the Eskimo, run by G. Malcolm Brown, a Queen's University professor, one of the most prominent physicians in Canada. And I'd like to compare this research, which seems at first glance to be rather troubling. He talks about comparing 59 healthy male Eskimos between 18 and 50, the ages of 18 and 50, on Southampton Island, with a control group of 85 healthy male medical students at Queen's, and studying them when the temperature in Kingston corresponded to that of Southampton Island. Now, I don't have to be a scientist to start to ask some questions about that and the ethics and morals of that kind of research. I'd certainly like to compare that, as I said, to some of the work that's being done in Alaska. The very same time, very similar physiological research by the Arctic Aeromedical Laboratory, which is the subject of a major congressional and scientific inquiry in the 1990s. So I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit in more than one way. I should also note that the US Department of Defense also launched a research and development board in the same year, in 1947, as its Canadian counterpart. Unsurprisingly, given the US military's wide range of interests, this board had a much more diverse roster of panels and experts and projects, drawing in all sorts of leading scholars, some of the most significant social scientists and natural scientists of the time, to discuss this dizzying roster of initiatives. And again, the Arctic, from meteorology and geology to the actual building of the dew line, garnered significant interest at this American board, which is even less well known than the Defense Research Board in Canada. You have these two boards. You have nominally civilian institutions like the Arctic Institute of North America, started in the Second World War. You have offices in Montreal and Washington, all considering this persistent problem, to quote from one Arctic Institute publication. Despite technical progress and the variety of modern mechanical equipment, despite all this great new technology that we have that came out of the war, the success of an operation often stands or falls with the nature of man itself. So many years ago, I stumbled across another institution, a little-known arm of the US Air Force, started during the Second World War. A place based at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, which is where Air University, which is a wonderful name for a university, Air University, and the Air Force Archive are. And this institution is called, the Arctic Desert Tropic Information Center. I just absolutely, as a historical geographer, I love that name. Arctic Desert and Tropic Information Center. Right through the 1950s, ADTIC published a number of studies in what it called survival geography. Again, a wonderful thing for a geographer to contemplate. What is survival geography? And these studies, unsurprisingly, as you can see from one of their early reports on Burma, are mostly concerned with distant other forms of nature and distant other forms of culture as well. But survival geography, by one standard, was perhaps most strikingly explored in Nevada, at the Nevada Proving Grounds, which later became the Nevada Test Site. A very short drive from Las Vegas. You could watch the nuclear tests from rooftops of casinos in Las Vegas during the 1950s. In Nevada, the US Army, in particular, attempted to understand and even harness the violently transformative force of nuclear weapons. And this starts in 1951 with a test codenamed DOG. It was the 9th test conducted at the Proving Grounds, which had only been open for about a year. During this test, as you can see, hundreds of soldiers are directed to attack an objective, as they called it, 500 yards from ground zero in a tactical troop maneuver, while several dozen moved yet closer to conduct what they called damage effects tests. So this is the first such troop test exercise on land. It's a formal demonstration of atomic warfare. A year and a half later, the Pentagon had essentially convinced the Atomic Energy Commission, which ran this site, to completely abandon its safety guidelines, at least for soldiers, or as they called themselves, GI guinea pigs. Their distance from ground zero had been drastically reduced, the tolerable amount of radiation increased, and the time before they marched toward the mushroom cloud shortened, essentially to nothing. You can remember with a sense of pleasure and accomplishment, their Nevada commander wrote, with somewhat of a sense of pleasure himself, that you were a real pioneer in experimentation of the most vital importance to the security of the United States. And this multiple ambiguous use of experiment in that sentence is a reminder that as a context, as seemingly unique as the Nevada Proving Grounds, Nevada test site, where they actually practiced war beneath the bomb, if you like, is actually far from exceptional. It's just one of a lengthy list of locations, as I mentioned, many within North America, for this study of military bodies under extreme environmental conditions. And by 1950 or so, all of this discussion of human experimentation was a subject of tremendous discussion and debate within the atomic bureaucracy. One eager proponent said, how much radiation can a man take? This was the question that drove his interest. And when the Pentagon pressed for additional military involvement at Nevada Test, it invoked two things. It said we need to indoctrinate soldiers in essential protective measures, and we need to observe the psychological effects of these tests. And those were the two reasons: indoctrinate and observe the psychological effects. And we'll see this pop up again and again as we move north. At the same time, the Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission are all advancing a certain representation of this place. It's a land, according to one newsreel, where lizards and sandflies are the only living things. Again, the correspondence with the North is very significant. The site, according to the chair of the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, was, quote, a good place to throw used razor blades. So again, all of this wasteland discourse, as we know from the work of people like Valerie Kulitz and others, clears this space for the militarization of the Desert West, or what Kulitz calls nuclear colonialism. And she quotes the Western Shoshone chief, Raymond Yowell, saying, we are now the most bombed nation in the world. So meanwhile, soldiers are showing up at this Camp Desert Rock, as it was called in Nevada, which looks a lot like Fort Churchill, to receive this indoctrination desired by their superiors. And it's no coincidence that this indoctrination, which is a kind of loaded word today, but really for militaries comes to stand in as a kind of unidirectional education that you will receive, you, the human subject, once you arrive in a new environment. This indoctrination, as I said, was accompanied by biomedical tests, a systematic research study that would inform, or as it turned out, simply justify more indoctrination. Right? So remember that second piece of the Pentagon's appeal for their more vigorous presence at the proving grounds. They wanted to observe the psychological effects of nuclear weapons. And to do this, to conduct this study, they didn't turn to an established academic institution or some distinguished scientists, but to a brand new contractor that they created specifically to conduct work in the military human sciences. Again, performance, motivation, training, morale, psychological warfare, man-machine systems. And this is a place called the Human Resources Research Office, or HUMRO. And it walks into the Nevada Proving Grounds in 1951 and basically botches the whole thing. The questionnaires are full of errors. It's asking soldiers to crawl around on contaminated soil for no apparent reason. Despite this, the Research and Development Board, back in the Pentagon, is more or less fine with it. Results can expected to appear superficially trivial, meaning the results of your experiments can look pretty useless, but the matter is of such importance that the research should be persisted in, utilizing every opportunity. So why this little detour to Nevada? Well, when I read about these flawed, maybe even preposterous experiments at the proving grounds, I was reminded of another image from another landscape seen by the military, to use J.D. Jackson's phrase. And that is the walk-around sleeping bag. And this actually exists. I Googled it recently, and it's now a thing that you can buy on eBay or something. It's cute pictures of kids walking around in a sleeping bag. The walk-around sleeping bag produced by the U.S. Air Force's Arctic Aeromedical Laboratory, which I've already mentioned, in Alaska. And this is part of the lab's, shall we say, broad interest in the North as a space for survival and combat. This is a place steeped in the human sciences exactly at the same time, very similar to work conducted in Nevada, very similar as well in that it ranges from the ridiculous to the injurious. They also, these two sites, Nevada, Alaska, share very similar research interests. War under arduous environmental conditions, but also protective clothing and equipment, vision, there's lots of studies of blindness and so on, morale and motivation, and a fascination with the seemingly exotic bodies of indigenous Alaskans. Meanwhile, southeast of Fairbanks, which is where the lab was, in a large tract of land known as Big Delta, the Army, the US Army, established an Arctic training center, home to an indoctrination school, there's that word again, a training company, a test and development section. And so during the 1950s, while you have tens of thousands of soldiers passing through Camp Desert Rock in Nevada, a smaller but similarly diverse cohort, perhaps 5,000, graduate from this Alaskan indoctrination school. I dug up some interesting photos from the Alaskan archives. I don't know if you can see them. They're little small collections of photos, undated, unlabeled, but sort of illustrating the activities of this Alaskan location. So what were soldiers doing here in Alaska at this indoctrination school? Well, according to one Army history, they were learning how to live with and not resist the northern climate and terrain. These activities that they participated in, skiing, rock climbing, map exercises, they were all valuable proving grounds for men as well as equipment. The Air Force had one of these facilities in Nome, Alaska, and was folded into this Army location in Big Delta in 1950. And the New York Times sent its correspondent, its famous military correspondent, Hanson Baldwin, to the Air Force facility in Nome. And what he wrote is that the school was helping to eliminate dread of the Arctic, the unreasoning psychological bugaboo that hampers personal efficiency and military operations in Alaska. So whether it's in Nevada or Alaska, these schools for indoctrination are really sites for the making and sharing of narratives about the possibility or the probability of war in these places. Right? The nuclear desert, the frozen north, these become regions with imaginative power, physical substance, where life is expressed really first and foremost as survival, and therefore inseparable from violence. Okay, so there's a growing body of scholarship on the American and Canadian Norths. Many of you will know this work across history, geography, and other fields, really working with all manner of texts from cultural representations to state policies. And this larger historical scholarship helps us understand where the military efforts that I've been describing fit into larger social and governmental interest in the Arctic during and after the Second World War. This is the era, of course, of high modernism, really the pinnacle of high modernism, right? The faith that engineering, planning, and technology could overcome environmental limitations, and when it's impressed on a landscape, transform it and harness it for the betterment of humankind. High modernism has a global history. It certainly has an Arctic history in the form of the Dew Line, new northern communities like Frobisher Bay, Iqaluit, and Inuvik. We certainly as well see a variation of this ambition, this transformative ambition, in the smaller human scientific research projects conducted on and in the North in the 50s. These are also, like the Dew Line, designed from a distance in southern offices or laboratories, treating northern communities and the nuances of northern ecology as secondary. And I think this is really, it's this era of northern scientific research, I don't think this is a surprise, that is the reason for all of the extensive discussions in the last few decades about doing northern research differently, more responsible, more collaborative models of northern fieldwork come out of this earlier, less sensitive era.